hello, wherever you are. You might be in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or somewhere else that I haven't mentioned. You're very welcome here, and I want to say thank you for turning up and thank you for coming. It's always so nice when we can get together, and it's a really great topic we're talking about today, which is around publishing in WIL, and I'm really excited to see you and to bring you all together. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands, of all the lands that we're currently sitting on across many nations. And it could be across, many different spaces. It could be work spaces, office spaces, or some sort of hybrid between the two. I want to pay my respects to the elders of these lands, of the past, of the present, and the emerging. My name is Dr. Bonnie Dean, and I'm from the ACEN Board of Directors, as well as the University of Wollongong, and we are talking today not just about researching WIL, but about the publishing in WIL, which is probably an area we haven't really discussed as much as we could have. And so I'm really excited to kick off this session and introduce our guests as well as our facilitators. What we'll do today is we will be watching a presentation. That presentation will go for about 20 minutes or so. After that presentation, we'll go into breakout rooms, and we'll be in those breakout rooms for about, say, 20 minutes or so. So if you've got questions bubbling up inside your minds, make sure you hold on to those questions in the breakout rooms. That's really the space where we can have that dialogue around publishing as well as researching and work integrated learning. If there is any technical difficulties, what I'll get you to do is to log off and log straight back into the same link. If that doesn't work, hang around your email and wait for further instructions. This session, the presentation, is being recorded, and we'll make sure that we circulate the recording as well as any slides to all those who registered. We'll also pop it up on the ACEN website as well. So that's all the housekeeping done. Now let's get on to the juicy bits. I'd love to introduce you, first of all, to our editors of the WIL Journal. That's the International Journal of Work Integrated Learning. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Carsten Zegua. He is the Editor-in-Chief of WIL, and Carsten is from the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. I'll just get you to give a wave, Carsten. That's it, thank you. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Anna Rowe. And Anna is from the University of New South Wales in Australia, and Dr. Ginny Preti, who is from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. And it's 10 p.m. in Canada, and we really appreciate that you've been able to join us, Judine, so late into the evening. We also have three other facilitators who are experienced researchers in WIL, and they will also be inside the breakout rooms to answer questions. So we have Associate Professor Denise Jackson, who is from the ACEN Board of Directors. We have Dr. Teresa Winchester-Cito, who's from the University of New South Wales, and Associate Professor Michelle Eadie, who is also on the ACEN Board of Directors as well. Well, that's it from me. Let's get into the good stuff. Anna, I'll invite you now to share your screen and unmute yourself.
Thanks, Bonnie.
From everyone else, what I'll get you to do is during this presentation, I'll invite you just to turn your videos off. So keep your videos off and keep yourself on mute. When we go into those breakout rooms, I'll encourage you to turn your videos back on again. But for now, let's see if we can just save some bandwidth. That would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Well, welcome everyone to today's session on today's ACEN research conversation on publishing in WIL. I hope that you'll find our insights useful as we, in getting your research published and out there. Brief overview of the presentation. We will first cover preparing your manuscript and the writing process, and then Carsten will talk a little bit about the review process, including what reviewers look for. And Judine will talk about common mistakes that people make in submitting articles for publication in journals. And we'll talk a bit about also how to respond to reviewer feedback. And then in the breakout rooms, as Bonnie mentioned, we have a couple of other people joining us who are also established and well-recognised researchers in their own right. And Teresa and Denise are actually also part of our editorial board. They're reviewers for the journal as well. So when you're thinking to submit a journal paper, it's important firstly to identify which journal or journals that you're thinking to target. Now, there are a number of different types of journals, which we won't get into so much, but I mean, WIL, for example, is a journal that has a very specific focus on will, but there are other journals that you might consider, such as general education journals or discipline-specific journals. There's really a really broad range of different journals, so it's important to think about which audience you want to target. And also there's other factors such as quality and so forth that you might consider. Really spend a lot of time in writing your journal article. Don't rush it, because a journal article is an important professional output, so it's important to submit a quality manuscript. I would suggest looking at examples in the journal that you're thinking to submit to, just to get a feel for what their expectations are. So that's one strategy that I would suggest. It's really important to ensure that your manuscript is formatted in accordance with the journal style, word counts, and formatting requirements. This is a really important thing that some people don't tend to pay much attention to, but it is really important, especially when the editors first see the paper. If they can see that it has been formatted properly, then it gives us a favourable impression of your work. Particularly referencing styles and that kind of thing. So definitely read the instructions for authors. That's really, really important. And when you decide to submit your manuscript, there are many different ways in which you can submit your manuscript. In WIL, for example, you email it to Carsten, who's the editor-in-chief, but other journals have different processes for submitting manuscripts. I'll now pass over to Carsten to talk a little bit about the review process. Carsten, you're on mute.
Oh, that was helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Just to explain a bit more what happens to your manuscript when you submit it to the journal, there's a process that falls in place. And here you have a flow diagram, which is a simplified diagram of what could happen with the manuscript. There are actually other interconnecting parts that may occur, including a few more feedback loops. Now, when the manuscript is first submitted to the journal, the editors will look at it and they'll determine whether or not the manuscript's within the scope of what the journal seeks and whether or not the manuscript is ready for a full review. We find at the moment that at that particular stage, an article can be rejected fairly early on. We're finding that that number is drifting up to around about 30%, slightly higher at the moment. So about 30% of the articles submitted are rejected at the early stage. Now, nearly always the reason for that is that the article is outside for what the journal is seeking. So we get some articles that are great articles about general education, but without any focus on work integrated learning, it's outside our scope. And we are still getting some articles that are focused on cooperative societies or cooperative entities like cooperative banking or cooperative farming groups, which, again, as interesting as that is, that's well outside the scope of what the journal seeks as well. And every now and then we'll get an article that's submitted that simply isn't up to what the journal has when it comes to expectations, and there's too much work at that stage to interact with the authors in order to get that article into space where it can be ready for review, and often those are rejected as well. If it progresses from that particular point, it will go to the editorial board. At that particular point, it will be sent out to 2 reviewers on the editorial board under a double-blind review. Now, double-blind review means is that the reviewers will not know who the authors are, and the author will not know who the reviewer is. So we go through a process of making sure that all the authors' names are removed from the document, but also from the document ownership details that are part of that document as well. Now, the editorial board does their review. They then submit those reviews back to the editors. And at that particular point, the editors themselves will do a review of the document and also do a review of the review itself to make sure that the review feedback is fair for what the document is. And at that particular point, often the editors themselves have additional feedback for the author too, perhaps things that the reviewers themselves may have missed. Then there are possible 5 possible outcomes for recommendations. One would be that is accepted as it is, but no changes whatsoever. To be honest, that never happens. There's always something. We're good at that. There might be some minor recommendations, amendments that are required, and often those are more things around some structural elements within the document, some missing details and some clarification. Major amendments tends to be a requirement of a section of the manuscript to be reworked, or significant additional information is required. Another outcome that we have is a major review, a major amendment, and then a re-review. And this is a little bit of an unusual category because a lot of journals don't have this. Most journals will treat this as a rejection. But what we have here is what we try and do here is that we see a article that has a story that is publishable, and that there is something in there that is worthy to be part of the literature, but the amount of amendments required is so significant that it essentially results in a whole rewrite of the manuscript itself, which means it has to start the re-review process again. From past, we've found that probably about half of those that fall in that category do eventually end up being published, but it does tend to be a bit of a long journey to get to that particular point. And of course, at this stage, you can also have the possibility of a rejection as well, and that sits around about the 10% mark on total. Now, the review feedback is given verbatim to the authors. They get to see all of the review comments, and the author then starts making amendments in order to address the issues that the reviewers have found in the manuscript, and then submits that back to the editor again. Now, at this particular point, the editor will do a re-review of the manuscript to see if the comments have been, if the changes have addressed the review comments made by the reviewers, and sometimes that requires some additional work again afterwards. So it's not unusual for the manuscript to be sent back to the authors for some additional work. From that particular point, if the amendments are appropriate, it goes to the copy editor, and at this point we think that there is a publishable story there, and it's about polishing that story and the presentation of that story, and to have the formats appropriate to what the journal seeks. And that again results in some correspondence between the copy editor and the author. And once those changes have been made, then it goes back to the editor again, and again it goes for a review at that particular point, but the review is much more focused on presentation of the article itself, not necessarily much about the content itself. And after then, you have, it's green box, it's a positive thing, and then you come at this stage of being published. When it gets published, it varies in time. Sometimes it's published within 2 weeks, sometimes it's published within 2 months. It depends a little bit about what cycle the journal's in at that particular time. Now, Anna, if you can just jump to the next slide. So what mysterious things do the reviewers look for when they're reviewing a manuscript? Well, one of the first things they look for is to see if there's an interesting story in the article itself. That they're looking for something that is publishable, something that adds to the literature itself, something that is new. They certainly do considerable focus on the research methods itself as one of the first areas they do focus on. They want to see enough information about the research methods in order to determine that the research methods were valid. And the issue here being potentially that if the research methods are not valid, then the conclusions that come from that particular research undertaking may not be valid as well. So that is an early focus for the reviewers. They're looking for evidence that the article itself is informed by literature and the theory that underpins that literature. And I want to have a feel that the authors themselves, that the researchers have a good understanding about the established knowledge that is out there in the literature. And that gives the reviewers and the editors confidence that the findings and the discussions of those findings are informed in the right context. We're looking for articles that are focused on the educational issue, not necessarily on the context of which the educational issue is within, and Judy will talk a little bit more around that, but we are very much focused about the educational issues that are within work integrated learning. There needs to be a clear separation between describing the findings and discussing the findings. So the findings need to be robust, they need to be critical, they need to be research informed and literature informed. And one of the best ways of doing that is to have discussion, to have describing the findings removed and separate from the discussion of the findings, because that allows you that freedom just to go a little bit further into the critical discussion of the findings itself. And that is the discussion section, that is the contribution to new knowledge in that literature. We're looking for evidence that the discussion and the claims made in the discussions are informed, are supported by the data. So the data has to be able to inform and support and evidence what the claims are. And we certainly would encourage that it's the strength of the data that should be the strength of the discussion. Not so much the words that are used, but the data itself is the strength of the claims that are being made. And once the article is being reviewed, there's always that question of, you know, so what? What has this article contributed? Why is this article significant? Why does this article stand out? So it needs to be able to answer the so what element of it. And of course, the last part of it, it needs to be well written and a coherent article. So I think that's goes without saying. Judine, I'll hand over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I think what you see here is a set of common mistakes that reviewers of journal articles have identified in the articles that they review. And what you'll see here is largely the flip side of what Karsten was talking about with respect to what reviewers are looking for. These are the things that when they see them, point to issues that need to be addressed in articles. So in comparison to telling a story, a common mistake that we see is that the story doesn't flow. That is, that the article isn't structured in such a way that it takes the reader through the description of the background literature that's been discussed, the methodology that was used, and then the findings and discussion. Closely tied to that is the idea of poor writing, so lacking exactness on wording. So this isn't just around the use of English language, this is also around the use of terminology, not being clear with definitions, and or using words loosely and sort of interchangeably without being precise about their use. Technical writing. So Anna commented that you should have a journal in mind. I would recommend that once you have a journal in mind, you're looking at the style of writing of other articles that are in the journal to get an idea of the expectations around the level of technical writing. Karsten mentioned this a little bit, but too much focus on the context is one of the common mistakes that we see, and not as much on the issue itself. Program appraisal, so program appraisal or evaluation is again something that we would see, and what typically would distinguish that is there might not be that theoretical underpinning that Karsten was talking about, which would then indicate that it's research. It's founded in theory, it's tied to the existing literature, and it's exploring an area of interest as opposed to a specific context. It lacks a critical discussion. So this is fairly common as well, where there'll be a description of what the findings are, but not that analysis in terms of the discussion. Weak data, so data that doesn't address the research questions or doesn't have the power to be able to draw conclusions from it. The claims, this is another common one, the claims are not well supported by the data. So the data may be strong, but the claims that are being drawn from the data may not match. Similarly, generalizing too much, going too far beyond what the data and the results actually suggest is a common error. And then kind of the flip side of that is lacking implications. So not digging into what does this mean? What is the so what? Why do the findings of this research matter? The next slide. Thank you. The other thing that we wanted to share with you is some advice on responding to reviewer feedback. And I would say this is specifically what we ask for with WIL, but also is common to other editorial processes that I've been through. One of the things that's interesting, if you've received feedback from a journal, is that, as Karsten mentioned, there's 2 reviewers that will have gone through your article and provided feedback, as well as potentially the editor providing feedback. And sometimes that feedback is contradictory. And that's always an interesting place for us as the editorial team when we get 2 reviews and they possibly have conflicting feedback for the authors. We try as much as possible to identify what the things we think need to be addressed from the reviewer's perspective. But as Karsten mentioned, we send the reviews back as we receive them, so we don't adjust the feedback. But I would say when you're addressing them or addressing the comments, it's a matter of identifying where you've made changes to address the comments that were made. And in the second bullet, if you disagree with a particular piece of feedback, then providing the explanation or rationale. And while our editorial board is highly skilled and very, very constructive in the feedback that they provide, there will be instances where they may not have the complete picture. And so it may be that there's a reason for the way you have provided something or the way you've done an analysis. So it is okay to disagree, but you do need to provide the reasoning for why you haven't addressed a piece of feedback provided by a reviewer. It does help us if you submit a response letter describing the changes that have been made. Some journals will require that. It's very helpful, and as it says, addressing each point of the reviewer editor feedback makes it a lot quicker for us to go through and ensure that the changes that have been requested have been addressed or made. I think it probably goes without saying that being respectful and polite is your best path forward through a smooth process. And lastly, a copy with track changes is helpful. So often what I would receive is that overview response letter describing the changes, a copy of the manuscript with track changes, and then sometimes a copy of the manuscript where the changes are accepted. So the flexibility of being able to look at any of those different formats for your changes is again really helpful in us being as quick as we possibly can in the turnaround process.
I'd just like to add to Judine's point about ensuring, and also Karsten touched on this about the discussion being research informed. One thing that I see a lot is often authors sometimes forget to bring back the literature discussed in the front end of the paper into the discussion at the end. So it's not only descriptive, but it's not actually informed by the literature that was the basis for the research. So I just wanted to add that is something that I notice does happen a bit. So it's really important to bring back that literature into the discussion.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and if I can add more as well, we do perhaps see on a fairly regular basis that the results and the discussion sections are merged together, and then we did allude to having that separate. One of the reasons why it's good to have them, well, one of the reasons why not to merge them together is that when the discussion and the results are merged together, there tends to be quite a heavy focus on describing the data, and the data seems to fall away. And it is quite important to have that distinction between discussing. But when you're writing an article, it kind of feels natural to start describing and then to start discussing at the same time. There's a natural tendency to do that. So it is quite difficult to separate them off at the start. But once you've done that, you'd find that the article's much, much stronger.
Bonnie, I think we're probably ready to go into the breakout rooms.
Fantastic, Anna. So I'll get you to start sharing your screen for me.
Oh, hang on a sec.
Okay.
Hang on. Trying to...
Do you want me to do it?
Yes, is that all right? I can't find the button.
Let me see if I can stop sharing your screen.
Thank you. Here it is.
Oh, you got it?
I did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much to Karsten, to Anna, and to Judine for your insights and your tips as well. We really appreciate that and bringing your experience forward to help us. We are going to go into the breakout rooms now. What you'll see in just a moment is a small invitation come up on your screen which says inviting you into one of the breakout rooms. So just click on that and you'll be whooshed away into a small breakout room. And in those rooms, I'll invite the facilitators to make themselves known and to start discussing some of those questions that we had on the screen there around publishing. So if you do have a burning question, this will be your opportunity to really ask those questions of experienced researchers and publishers. Okay, so I've opened up the breakout rooms now and I'll see you back here in about 20 minutes. Enjoy the conversation. Bye, see you soon.